Hello, welcome to lesson 7.3B. I've entitled this video, The Pyramid of Power. This video is going to cover pages 436 to 439. What were the characteristics of a white Southern society? The Old South is often pictured as a land of vast plantations worked by hundreds of enslaved African Americans. Such grand estates did exist in the South. However, most white Southerners were not rich planters. In fact, most whites owned no enslaved African Americans at all. If you look at this pie graph of the Southern's population, what you can see is a third were basically African American slaves. You had a very small percentage of free African Americans. And of the, if you count that up, that's about 66%. Nearly half of the South were whites who did not own a single slave. So for question number one, what was the reality of most white Southerners at that time in history that goes against the picture that's often falsely portrayed? That most were slave owners. That's simply not true. Most did not own a single slave. The cottonocracy. The group at the top. A planter was someone who owned at least 20 enslaved workers. In 1860, only one white Southerner in 30 belonged to a planter family. An even smaller number, less than 1%, owned 50 or more enslaved workers. These wealthy families were called the cottonocracy because they made huge amounts of money from cotton. These rich planters lived mainly in the cotton belt of the lowland South and in coastal areas of South Carolina, Georgia, and Louisiana. Though few in number, their views and ways of life dominated the South. And now we can answer a couple questions. Number two, what is a planter? A planter was someone who owned at least 20 enslaved workers. Number three, in 1860, what fraction of white Southerners belonged to a planter family? Well, you had 1 in 30, so 1/30th belonged to a planter family. That's a very small percentage. Number four, what percentage of white Southerners owned 50 or more slaves? Less than 1%. Number five, what was the cottonocracy? The cottonocracy was the group of people in the South who were completely wealthy due to the cotton boom of that time period. They were very rich and they made their profits from cotton. And they dominated the way of life and the views in the South, even though they were a very small percentage of the people. So at the top of the pyramid of power, you have the cottonocracy. The rich planters built elegant homes and filled them with expensive furniture from Europe. They entertained lavishly. They tried to dress and behave like European nobility. Because of their wealth and influence, many planters became political leaders. Planters hired white overseers to run day-to-day affairs on their plantations and to manage the work of enslaved people. Sometimes enslaved African Americans, called drivers, were allowed to oversee their fellow workers. And then here we have a little thing on the overseer. The field slaves were driven all day long by a white overseer with a whip. At about the age of 12, a child's work became almost the same as an adult's. Slaves got Sundays off and maybe parts of Saturday, unless it was during harvest. On very hot days, slaves might be given 1 to 2 hours off at midday. Slaves sometimes hunted and fished during the free time. A field worker's day was filled with hard work. And now we can answer question number 7. Let's continue with 6. What was life like for the cottonocracy? Well, they had these rich, beautiful homes. They filled them with expensive furniture. They had lots of lavish parties. In other words, they had many people over to show them how rich they were. And they tried to dress like the old nobility from Europe. Number 7, due to their wealth and influence, what did many members of the cottonocracy become in the South? They became political leaders. And so when problems emerged, like over slavery, where they were the ones that were making the decisions in our Congress for the southern states because they had these political jobs. And therefore, they fought for things that most Southerners didn't have, which was slavery. Number 8, while many plantation owners were away from the plantation, they would hire white overseers to do what for them? Well, the white overseers would run the day-to-day operations of the plantation, and they managed the work of the enslaved people. So they were almost like the boss of the slaves while the master or the plantation owner was gone. Number 9, what role did drivers play on the plantation? Well, drivers were enslaved African Americans, and sometimes they were allowed to oversee their fellow workers as well. Below the cottonocracy on the pyramid of power were the small farmers. About 75% of Southern whites lived on small family farms. These, quote, plain folk, owned the land they farmed. They might also own one or two enslaved African Americans. Unlike planters, plain folk worked with their enslaved workers in the fields. Small farmers could be found in most parts of the South, but their numbers were fewer in the Cotton Belt and in coastal regions of the South where plantation agriculture dominated. Among these farm families, helping one another was an important duty. Quote, people who lived miles apart counted themselves as neighbors, wrote a farmer in Mississippi. Quote, and in case of sorrow or sickness, there was no limit to the service neighbors provided. So now we can answer question number 10. What percentage of white Southerners were small farmers? Well, you had about 75% of the Southern whites, so 3/4 of those Southern whites were small farmers. Number 11, what were some ways that small farmers or plain folk were different than the Cottonocracy? Well, number 1, they weren't as wealthy, so that's an obvious one. But number 2, they had many less or fewer slaves. They only had 1 or 2 slaves, unlike the planters who had 20 or more. Next, the plain folk actually worked next or side by side with their slaves, so they would have a better relationship with their slaves than the planters. Poor whites. Lower on the social ladder were poor whites. These whites did not own enslaved African Americans. Many did not own the land they farmed. Instead, they rented it, often paying the owner with part of their crop. Many barely made a living. Poor whites often lived in the hilly, wooded areas of the upland South, north and west of the Cotton Belt. They planted crops such as corn, potatoes, and other vegetables. They also herded cattle and pigs. Poor whites had hard lives, but they enjoyed rights that were denied to all black people, enslaved or free. So question number 12. What are some ways that poor whites were different than the small farmers? Well, number 1, they did not own African American slaves. Number 2, many of them didn't even own the land that they farmed. Number 3, they were much poorer than the people that were above them, called the plain folk. If you notice, many of these poor whites lived in the hilly, wooded areas, and if you think about it, that's where we get the phrase hillbilly. Comparing northern and southern whites. Like northern whites, most southern whites were farmers. Most white farmers in both regions were small farmers. However, there were important differences in the white populations of the two regions. In the South, the wealthiest whites were planters who made their money from the work of enslaved African Americans. In the North, the wealthiest whites were capitalists who made their money from investing in industry. There were many white industrial workers and middle-class people living in cities in the North. Relatively few Southerners of any class lived in the cities. So now we can answer a couple of questions. Number 13, what was the biggest difference between the wealthiest Northerners and the wealthiest Southerners? Well, the wealthiest Northerners were capitalists who made their money from investing in industry, where in the South, the wealthiest whites were the people who made their money from the work of slaves. Number 14, what was the biggest difference between the urbanization of the North and the South at that time? Well, urbanization happened a lot in the North. Many white industrial workers and middle class lived in cities in the North, and that's where we had lots of big urban centers, where there were very few big urban centers in the South. What was life like for African Americans in the South? Both free and enslaved African Americans lived in the South. Their legal and political conditions were different. Although free under the law and with certain legal rights, free African Americans faced harsh discrimination. Enslaved African Americans had no rights at all. Free African Americans. Most free African Americans were descendants of enslaved people who were freed during and after the American Revolution. Others had bought their freedom. In 1860, more than 200,000 free blacks lived in the South. Most lived in Maryland and Delaware, where slavery was in decline. Others lived in cities such as New Orleans, Richmond, and Charleston. Many free African Americans reached an impressive level of success. Working as farmers, laborers, and artisans, such as blacksmiths, carpenters, and cobblers, they contributed to and influenced Southern life. Some ran their own businesses, such as inns and barbershops. A few became large plantation owners, growing cotton and owning enslaved workers. Now we can answer question 15. What were the two most common ways an African American was free in the South at that time? Well, number 1, they were either descendants of people who had been freed for fighting during the Revolutionary War against Britain, and secondly, others had bought their freedom. Question 16. Why did most of the free African Americans in the South at that time live in Maryland and Delaware? Well, first of all, these were states closer to the North, which were free states, and secondly, slavery was in decline in those two states. The slave system just wasn't working as well there, and so it was in decline, so it was better to live there than in the deep South, where slavery was flourishing. White slave owners did not like free African Americans living in the South. They feared that free African Americans set a dangerous example, encouraging enslaved African Americans to rebel. Also, slave owners justified slavery by claiming that African Americans could not take care of themselves. Free African Americans proved this idea wrong. To discourage free African Americans, Southern states passed laws that limited their freedom and economic opportunities. Free African Americans were not allowed to vote or travel. In some Southern states, they had to move out of the state or risk the chance of being kidnapped and enslaved. Despite these limits, free African Americans were able to make a life for themselves and make valuable contributions to Southern life. For example, Norbert Rillieux invented a machine that revolutionized the way sugar was refined. Another inventor, Henry Blair, patented a seed planter. And now we can answer a couple of questions here. 17. What were the two main reasons that white slave owners did not like free African Americans living in the South? Well, number one, they feared they set a dangerous example that might encourage other enslaved African Americans to rebel. And secondly, it totally went against their statement that African Americans couldn't take care of themselves. Well, if free African Americans were taking care of themselves, that proved them wrong. Number 18, what were some of the ways that free African Americans were discriminated against in the South at that time? Well, they had laws that were passed against them to limit their freedom and economic opportunities, such as they weren't allowed to vote, they weren't allowed to travel, and in some cases, if they didn't leave a state that had a big percentage of slavery, they could risk being kidnapped and then said that they were a slave themselves. So people could lie and basically force them into slavery. Enslaved African Americans. By 1860, enslaved African Americans made up 1/3 of the South's population. Most worked as field hands on cotton plantations. Both men and women cleared new land and planted and harvested crops. Children helped by pulling weeds, collecting wood, and carrying water to the field hands. By the time they were teenagers, they worked between 12 and 14 hours a day. Daily labor in the fields bound enslaved workers into a community of people who tried to help and protect one another. On large plantations, some enslaved African Americans had better positions. They might work as household servants or as skilled artisans, such as carpenters and blacksmiths. Such jobs might entitle workers to better food or clothing than field hands. A few enslaved people worked in cities. Their earnings, however, belonged to their owners. Unlike free African Americans, enslaved African Americans could not easily start their own businesses. Another major difference between the social circumstances of free and enslaved African Americans was that enslaved African American families could be broken up by their owners, with family members sold separately and to different owners. While they faced discrimination, free African American families were not forced to separate. And now we can answer a couple of questions here. Number 19, what percentage of the South's population consisted of enslaved African Americans? 1/3, or 33% of the South's population were enslaved African Americans. 20, what was life like for the enslaved African Americans at that time? Well, as you can see, many worked in cotton plantations. They cleared new land, they planted and harvested crops. The children did other jobs like pulling weeds, collecting wood, and carrying water. By the time they were teenagers, they worked 12 to 14 hours a day. They were very closely bound together because they were enslaved, and so they had to work together and support one another. On larger plantations, some had better positions in the slave system. They might work as household servants, or they might get to actually be an artisan and make things, and they would have a little bit better rights than the people who were field hands. And even the African Americans that worked in the cities as slaves, they didn't even get to keep that money. They had to give it to their owners. And they couldn't start their own businesses. Just a few more things about house slaves versus domestic slaves. Most house slaves were living under better conditions than field workers. However, house slaves did not get Sunday off and usually attended church with the master and mistress. House slaves cleaned, cooked, served meals, and took care of the children. Some house slaves lived in attics, closets, or corners in the big house, even if their families lived in the quarters. A cook's day was long and hard. A cook got up early in the morning to cook breakfast, and the day ended with cleaning up after dinner and gathering firewood for the next day. These slaves sometimes stole food from the owner. A house slave had a better opportunity to learn how to read and write. They often listened on their owner's conversations, so they were able to warn field slaves of the owners auctioning certain slaves and other important things. House slaves did many other things, such as waited on tables, washed, ironed, took up and put down carpets, hauled the large steaming pots for the preservation of the fruits, lifted the barrels with cucumber soaking in brine, opened up the barrels of flour, swept floors, dusted furniture, hoed and weeded gardens, and collected the chicken eggs. They also took care of the infants, allowing the mistress to do whatever she wanted. These slaves often weaved, quilted, and spun lines. Although house slaves had more privileges, being a house slave was not much, if any, easier than being a field worker. A field slave worked from sunrise to sunset. During harvest, they would work an 18-hour day. Women field slaves worked the same as men. Pregnant women were expected to work until the child was born. After birth, the woman worked in the field with the child on her back. At the end of the workday, the slave would have his or her cotton weighed. The minimum amount of cotton to be picked in one day was 200 pounds. And you know what would happen if you didn't get your 200 pounds. It was not good. Well, thank you for watching. Since this is Halloween week, I've got a Halloween joke for you. What kind of makeup do ghosts wear? Mascara. Thank you and have a nice day.